Welcome to the Explainer. All right, let's just jump right in today because we are looking at a huge mystery. If you've ever scrolled through New York City apartment listings and literally gasped out loud at the prices, yeah, you're definitely not alone. Today, we're figuring out exactly why living in New York costs a small fortune. And spoiler alert, we're going way beyond the basic idea of just high demand.
It's the ultimate economic question, isn't it? Why is rent in New York so famously, almost comically, sky high? Now, a lot of folks immediately just say, well, millions of people want to live there. And sure, market demand is a massive piece of the puzzle. But if we really want to understand the nuts and bolts of how this city works, stopping there, that's just incomplete.
Because here is the real twist. It isn't just demand. It is actually a fascinating, tangled web of unintended legal consequences. As we'll see in this explainer, there are a bunch of really well-intentioned state and local laws designed to help people that inadvertently end up acting like a massive catalyst for those crazy market rents. Honestly, most residents have no idea how these rules quietly interact to drive their monthly costs up.
So here's our roadmap to figure this all out. We're looking at the high rent mystery, rent stabilization side effects, costly codes and evictions, zoning and land use, the Airbnb factor, and finally, the housing supply squeeze. Let's get right to it. Starting off with Section 2, rent stabilization side effects. Okay, so take a look at New York City's rent stabilization law, or RSL. The goal here is super straightforward, right? Put a limit on how much landlords can increase the rent every year so tenants are protected. It sounds great, but it creates a pretty massive unintended side effect. It actually discourages new construction from moderately priced apartments. Because the profits are totally capped on those stabilized units, developers just pivot. They pour their energy and capital into luxury apartments that are completely exempt from the rules, leaving way fewer average price units for the average person.
To really picture this, imagine just one apartment building. On the left side, you've got a long-term stabilized tenant who's paying well below market rent. On the right side, a brand new incoming tenant. To make up for the capped returns on that first unit, the landlord is basically forced to charge sharply higher rents for the unregulated units. So that new tenant, they're effectively subsidizing the whole system, paying a massive premium just to move into the exact same neighborhood.
Moving right along, let's look at Section 3, costly codes and evictions. So, New York's housing maintenance code requires buildings to be kept to strict health and safety standards, which absolutely is necessary, but it triggers this mechanical ripple effect. Step 1, you have these strict codes applied to older buildings. Step 2, keeping them up to code leads to incredibly high repair costs for things like plumbing, heating, or the foundation. Step 3, because landlords have super high compliance costs, they apply for rent increases to cover those expenses, passing the massive bill directly down to the renters. And that brings us to a really crucial piece of jargon you need to know: Major Capital Improvements, or MCI. Basically, this is the legal process where landlords can recoup the money they spent on those expensive, required renovations by raising the rent for everyone in the building. It perfectly illustrates how the cost of keeping these older buildings up to code doesn't just vanish into thin air. It gets distributed right back into the monthly rent checks of the tenants. Now, another major layer of legal complexity here involves eviction laws. New York has really strong tenant protections on the books, making evictions highly challenging. And look, keeping politics completely out of it and just looking at the raw economics, anytime you have legal friction, it creates an economic impact. Here's how it plays out in reality. Because landlords know there's a lengthy, high legal barrier to removing a tenant who stops paying or causes issues, they're taking on financial risk. And how do businesses deal with risk? Pass-through costs. Landlords basically hike the rent for new incoming tenants to build a financial cushion. On top of that, developers look at that perceived legal complexity and just avoid creating rental units in those complex areas altogether, which of course keeps the overall housing supply incredibly tight. All right, Section 4, which brings us to the physical bottleneck of the city: zoning and land use. Picture a developer who actually wants to build a giant, multi-unit apartment building to house more people. They almost instantly slam into 3 bottlenecks. First up, single-use zoning, which legally restricts a lot of areas to low-density residential or commercial. Second, strict height restrictions and floor area limits that legally prevent taller buildings. And third, NIMBYism. Not in my backyard. This is where neighborhood objections have really strong legal backing, delaying or entirely killing new projects before a shovel even hits the dirt. At the end of the day, it's just a simple math problem. By legally preventing taller, denser buildings, these regulations are physically constraining the housing supply. When you put a hard cap on the number of units you can build in a city where millions of people desperately want to live, you're directly contributing to higher rents. And as if the housing supply wasn't squeezed enough, we have Section 5, the Airbnb factor. New York has a bunch of complex regulations for short-term rentals. The big one to know is the one-unit rule. It states that apartments cannot be rented short-term unless the owner is actually living there with you. The whole idea is to keep apartments on the traditional rental market. But here's the catch. While the rule exists on paper, trying to enforce it across a sprawling city is highly inconsistent. And what happens when enforcement is spotty? Unintended scarcity. Because short-term rentals can bring in serious cash, a lot of landlords just illegally convert their units anyway. Every single time an apartment is flipped into a weekend vacation spot, it is instantly erased from the long-term rental market. What's wild is how directly this hits the everyday renter. Suddenly, you have way fewer traditional long-term units available, but the exact same number of people trying to find a home. So competition just ramps up. That basic drop in supply turns apartment hunting into a nightmare, driving price tags way higher for traditional tenants who are just trying to sign a standard one-year lease. Okay, Section 6, the housing supply squeeze. Let's zoom out and put all these clues together. The conclusion here is pretty undeniable. Sky-high rent isn't just a byproduct of New York being popular. It's not just because everyone loves the bagels and Broadway. It is a mathematically proven squeeze caused by a tangle of specific laws. Let's quickly recap our 5 legal suspects. Rent stabilization distorts the market for brand new tenants. Maintenance codes force expensive repairs that end up getting passed on to renters. Eviction laws add risk premiums to everyone's lease. Zoning restrictions physically cap how many homes can be built. And short-term rental rules, because of weak enforcement, bleed traditional apartments off the market. Now listen, every single one of these laws serves a valid protective purpose individually, but collectively, they form a massive, impenetrable bottleneck. I want to read this powerful summary straight from the analysis because it really hits the nail on the head. Collectively, they restrict housing supply, increase costs for landlords, and push market rents higher for new tenants. That is the mechanical reality of these laws. They bounce off each other to make building, maintaining, and renting apartments slower, riskier, and way more expensive. Which leaves us with a fascinating, super delicate balancing act to think about. Can a city robustly protect its current tenants, ensure buildings are safe, and preserve the neighborhood vibe without accidentally pricing out the entire next generation of renters? It is a complex puzzle of urban economics for sure, but understanding these 5 laws is absolutely the crucial first step to solving it. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those hard questions, and I'll see you next time.